amazing group of experts who are going to be talking to you about their work in the environmental justice field. I'll be introducing our moderator, Laura Merrifield, who is a Master in Public Policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School. Laura, from Long Beach, California, is a Master in Public Policy student at Harvard Kennedy School. They come from a community organizing background with a focus on civic engagement, immigrant rights, education, and the social determinants of health. Laura has supported environmental justice efforts at local and statewide levels and is currently studying the impact of wildfires on socially vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay. If ever there's a moment where you can't, just let us know. Thank you so much for joining us today on today's panel. I'm going to briefly give an introduction of our panelists and then dive in. I want to preface, we're actually, and this is some of the great work of our panel content developers, but this will be a non-traditional panel. We will have some initial remarks from everyone here, but then we're actually going to break you into smaller groups to talk one-on-one with our panelists and engage a little more interactively with this material. Then later we're going to come back to kind of synthesize what we've learned and talked about and be able to debrief and ask some final questions. So if you have some burning questions for the panelists, those will really come out in our small group and then at the end of the day, so letting you know that. So I'm going to start with Lawrence Reynolds. Lawrence Reynolds is a retired pediatrician and the past president and CEO of the Mott Children's Health Center in Flint, Michigan. In 2015, he joined a network of residents, health professionals, community organizations, researchers, and other nonprofits when a series of state-appointed financial managers and all levels of government refused to recognize the concerns about risks to public health from our water sources, processing, and distribution systems. The issues of water access and affordability as a fundamental human right and environmental justice, in particular environmental racism, have expanded the understanding of the Flint water crisis and the scope of his advocacy activities. Dr. Reynolds has a BA in political science from Wayne State University and has worked to improve maternal, child, and community health in FQHC since he received a National Health Service Corps scholarship in 1974 when he entered Howard University College of Medicine. And one of the happiest days of his professional life was the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Yes. One of the most pivotal incidents in his medical career was hearing Dr. Herbert Needleman speak about lead poisoning at a conference more than 30 years ago, despite an orchestrated smear campaign by the lead industry, which I think is something we'd love to hear more about as we continue. And so, next we have Leilani Doctor, JD candidate at Harvard Law School. Leilani is a third-year JD candidate at Harvard Law School with a focus on Indigenous people's rights and environmental law. She's originally from Honolulu, Hawaii, and is a long-standing advocate for Pacific Islanders. Before law school, she worked on community consultation, mediation, and environmental impact assessments in the state of Hawaii. In 2014, she graduated from Duke University with a BA in International Comparative Studies and French. While in school, she worked as a teaching assistant for the Literacy Through Photography program in Durham Public Schools and Arusha, Tanzania with the Duke Engage program. And at Harvard, she currently serves as the president of the student government and is the former co-president of the Native American Law Students Association. Following law school, she hopes to combine her interests of international relations, indigenous rights, and natural resource management in her work as a litigator. So thank you, Leilani. And next, I will introduce Seth. Seth Magnin is a part policy, swamp, and community rebuilder, having served states and local governments around the country in disaster recovery efforts in public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Following Hurricane Katrina, Seth went to New Orleans, working with FEMA, and after a year transitioned to swinging hammers with Habitat for Humanity, where he felt he could make more of an impact. Seth went on to work with the states of Louisiana and New York on large-scale recovery programs, including the Louisiana Office of Community Development, the New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, and the New York Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. Later, Seth worked with multiple jurisdictions around the country on the $1 billion HUD-funded National Disaster Resilience Competition, focusing on responding and adapting to the impacts of climate change through development of multidimensional recovery plans and projects. Seth led teams with the states of Louisiana, California, and Shelby County, Tennessee. Seth is currently embedded with the Puerto Rico Department of Housing in San Juan, supporting the design and launch of a holistic, long-term $20 billion recovery portfolio focused on housing, economic development, infrastructure, and planning initiatives. Seth has a joint BA in Spanish and Political Science from the University of Arizona and a master's from Tulane University in Latin American Studies, where he focused on international development and global health. Thank you. Next, I will introduce Heather Mcteer Toney. Heather Mcteer served as the first African-American, first female, and youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. In 2014, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as Regional Administrator for Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast Region. Known for her energetic and genuine commitment to people, her work has made her a national figure in public service, diversity, and community engagement. Previously working on local government policy initiatives and the Moms and Mayors program for Moms Clean Air Force, Heather now leads the field program. Heather holds a bachelor's degree from Spelman College in Atlanta and a law degree from Tulane University School of Law. She loves triathlons and bacon, and at any time can be found chasing her toddler or riding an old classic cars with her husband and daughter. Thank you, Heather. And last but not least, I will introduce Mark Weiskopf. Mark is the Cecil K. and Philip Drinker Professor of Environmental Epidemiology and Physiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the Departments of Environmental Health and Epidemiology. Dr. Weiskopf received his PhD in neuroscience from the University of California, San Francisco, and his science doctorate in epidemiology from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He also spent 2 years as an epidemic intelligence service officer with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, working on environmental health issues in the Wisconsin State Health Department. His neuroscience work focused on molecular and cellular aspects of neural signaling and plasticity, and his epidemiological work focuses on the influence of environmental exposures on brain health across the life course. In particular, his research focuses on environmental risk factors for outcomes such as autism spectrum disorders, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, cognitive function dementia, and psychiatric conditions. He also explores the use of physiologically based methods for assessing toxicant effects on the brain and epidemiological methods issues to improve causal interference from observational environmental health studies. So I know those were a lot to hear, but I think it's important to understand the backgrounds our wonderful panel comes from. So you join me in just giving a round of applause. So to get us started, I want to really kind of understand a little more about all of you and the work you've done, and really remembering that this panel is focused on environmental justice. Environmental justice, I think, is defined in many ways, but it's defined by environmental injustices and what we're trying to create, we're trying to fix. And so I'd love to hear from you. As an introduction, I want to make sure our audience really understands this connection and why this connection matters. So I'd love for you to introduce yourselves and share a bit about a specific injustice you've seen in your work and how it impacts those most marginalized, that connection between those facing poverty and environmental justice. Is that a fair start?
That's a fair start.
All right, and I'll start with you.
All right, well, show my first, I promise only 5 slides, and the only reason is because I just want to have this concept stuck in your head, and maybe it'll answer some of what was just asked. Next slide, please. And I showed the first one so you understand that I am speaking for my community and my fellow residents. And in Flint, we're careful not to use the term citizen because everybody who lives in Flint is not a citizen. And we want to make sure we are not leaving our friends and our neighbors out. And also, I told my grocer, Franklin, that I was coming to speak at Harvard, and he got silent for a moment, and he looked at me, and the brother said to me, "Tell them it's just like Tuskegee." Franklin has 9-month-old twins. So his wife was pregnant at the tail end of the lead exposure. But the betrayal and the anger and the depression and the distrust that he said in that statement is emblematic of what we have been going through. So you'll hear repeatedly, "Why don't you all just get over it?" Well, we've been trying to get over it for the last 400 years, and for some of us longer. So the slide that I'm showing you is just so you can go back to the, yes. you can get an idea of how I have tried to fit these concepts together in my head. Health in all policies. And that looks at the impact of any action no matter where you live, work, and play. Is that familiar to many of you? But the implications of that, the ramifications go on and on. The environmental health precautionary principle. In other words, you don't introduce anything into the environment that you're not sure will cause no harm. In the past, the pressure has always been on us, the citizens or consumers or residents, to prove that something is dangerous. And they say, oh, well, what is it? Association is not causation. Environmental justice is an aspect of this. And you know, there are regulations that cover that, some weak, some strong. And there's the concept of health equity. And really, it all revolves around human rights and civil rights. So the question is, will we run our states like businesses? And I reject that hypothesis. And also, will we use water as a commodity instead of a human right? In other words, you use it to balance the budget, or you only give it to those who can afford it. And let's go 2 more, and I'll stop talking. I covered that, yes. And that is the precautionary principle. And none of this stuff is new. It's just, okay, how do we apply it? How do we get those ideas transferred into regulations when we talk about things like collective impact, when we talk about environmental justice communities? And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds. Leilani.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii, and my work before I came to law school was really deeply steeped in community organizing for Native Hawaiians. Specifically, the injustice that I addressed and encountered all the time was hunting and fishing rights and reserving those rights for subsistence living. And so one of the ways that it has kind of been impeded, I guess, within Hawaii is that you have this interesting tension between environmentalism and this idea of conservation, and then preserving the rights for subsistence living for your native and also just rural populations. And that was something that we had to work really deeply with the state and federal government, because as you enact more and more of these environmental regulations and laws, you have a tendency to forget that there's also people who depend on that environment for their living. And these people are some of the most impoverished and marginalized people in this country. So in coming to law school, I actually expanded on this towards Native American tribes and really tried to find the legal triggers as to how can you ensure these reserved rights of hunting and fishing and subsistence living for tribes. And something that's really interesting is that these rights are only protected by the treaties that were actually enacted back in the 1700s and 1800s. And so you have to go all the way back to those historical documents to figure out if these tribes are even guaranteed these rights anymore. And in fact, the Supreme Court has regularly kind of shrunken these rights in the idea that, hey, we overruled this treaty. Basically, Congress overruled this treaty with this environmental law. And so there's a huge legal battle that goes on almost every Supreme Court term over each tribe's hunting and treaty rights. And that's something that extends into not just their hunting and fishing, but also their water access and the ways that other companies can kind of do stuff upriver that has huge effects on the tribes and on their reservations. And that's something that we've seen in the West a ton, and I'm really excited to continue to work on this. But most importantly, it's that you have to have the community out there with their actual advocacy. So something that is so important is when you have these consultations, when you have EPA come out and say we want to do this regulation, to get the tribe there, which is usually a huge effort in itself. That's something that is really inaccessible to these communities. And I mean, you can just imagine, it's you don't even have proper schooling on most reservations, and then they're expected to go into these very educated kind of spaces and say, we don't want this regulation because it affects this right. And so something that I'd love to talk with you guys about is how do you translate, how do you empower these communities through the immense amount of power and, privilege that we have to be here at Harvard. So I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank you.
So much to chew on there with what you just said. I want to jump right in on it. In particular, it makes me think immediately of the work that's ongoing with the Ile-de-Jean Charles tribe in Louisiana and Terrebonne Parish, which is a project I had been working on. Left in terms of things, I guess, where I got started, my background. I went to New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina, and that was a big eye-opener for me. I was initially doing work with FEMA on the individual assistance program, so meeting with residents across the greater New Orleans area. And when I think it really struck me what was going on there was when I went over the Industrial Canal. For anybody that knows the layout of New Orleans, there are a number of canals, and when you cross the Industrial Canal, you go into the lower Ninth Ward. And when I drove over that canal, I still think about what you can see. It's a different level of visibility. And it was amazing in a gut-wrenching way. But I went on from there, and that FEMA experience was really tough. For me, it was a tough year, and that was why I went to work with Habitat for Humanity. I wanted to do something that was hands-on. And from there, I've gone to work inside programs to try and change policy. It's a tough battle. Where we're at right now and where we've been, I think in Louisiana, there's so much at the local level, state level. It's ongoing. But with the Ile-de-Jean Charles in particular, there are a lot of challenges there that we see, and this is a disappearing island for the youth. For those of you that don't know it, you may have heard about it. It was on CNN last week, but it's a real challenge because you're dealing with two, and they're not necessarily federally recognized tribes, but they are living together on this island, and then there's a whole diaspora that's associated, and who has ownership and how they are impacted by climate change and by sea level rise, and what that means for their ownership and their legacy of their history and their tradition, their families on this island. And of course, there's a whole history associated with forced relocation, so it's also something that's very challenging for that discussion. And then how do you incentivize someone to make a positive decision in different generations and what that looks like. So that's thinking about Louisiana. In California with wildfires, I was doing work in the state of California previously as well. And there are people that have alternative lifestyles that live off the land, and wildfires come through, and they don't have access to resources because they don't have a documented residence necessarily. There are migrant laborers that live in work camps in California that don't have access to resources but are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of wildfires. And so, how to create programs that can meet these needs is an ongoing challenge, and it's something that, we have a lot of work to do at all sides, on the FEMA side and the HUD side. And the work that I'm doing right now in Puerto Rico is a part of that. And certainly, we can talk more when we do our breakout. I won't go on, but I've said a lot, so I'll pass it on.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. When I think about specific instances of how environmental injustices are impacting us today, I think about North Birmingham, Alabama, where there's a community that's sitting, it's a primarily African-American community, there's a fence line community. Fence line is a community that sits right alongside an industrial plant or organization. And for generations, this community has dealt with air pollution that is coming over right across the fence, right where they live and work, such to the point that if you go outside, if you take your hand and put it along the car, you're going to pull up something, some type of dust. If they put their clothes out on a clothesline, it's going to be filled with some type of material that their children are playing in. When I think about environmental injustices, I think about a space that's out in Anaconda, the brownfield site out in Montana, where there are whole playgrounds and places where children go to do their sports, where there are signs up that say, be cautious of being on this property. I'm a river baby. I'm from the Mississippi Delta River area, where it's been known as one of the most impoverished places in the entire country. I think of it as home, and I think of it as God's country. My place where my parents raised me and where my friends and my family are today. But even right now today, that's a place that, like Louisiana, it is Mississippi River Delta. It is protected by by levees, the very levees that the Army Corps of Engineers fight to make sure are protecting us from the river, and the exact same ones that the federal government right now is trying to move $3 billion out of to put towards a border wall. So the issues of environmental justice you cannot talk about without talking about the injustices. My work through being a mayor, being a regional administrator for EPA, and right now work that I love with Moms Clean Air Force, an organization of over 1 million moms and dads across the country that are dedicated to protecting their children from climate change and from air pollution issues. Every single day I get an opportunity to talk to and advocate with mothers who are trying to do the same thing I'm doing. I'm a mom of 3, 2 of which are at home, 1 of which is a toddler. I think about them every single day in my work because there are communities across this country that are dealing with this that need this level of advocacy. 1 in 9 African American children suffer from asthma. That's a rate for African American children and Latino children that's far above of white children in this country. Over 1 million African Americans live within a mile of an oil and gas operation. That's here in the United States today. So the issues that we're talking about are touching communities of color very, very closely, such that they cannot be escaped. And when we think about that in conjunction with climate, we think about the IPCC report that's come out that has told us that if we don't do something about climate within the next 12 years, my 2-year-old will be 14, and we will be in a place where we have made irreversible changes to climate, extreme weather. That's what impacts communities of color. That's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about the increase in the hurricanes that are coming, what happens with sea level rise, and how that impacts the most vulnerable, poor people each and every day. Because what has to come out of this group and what has to come from you, and what I'm sure my colleagues would agree on, is we have to take real world solutions back to people. They cannot function off of a research paper. They need solutions. They need actions. And it's going to come from the best and brightest, but it has to impact all of us, most certainly the poorest of us.
Thank you. Yeah, so those are all great intros to this. I guess, so I come from this from, a good segue from that, because I'm on that research paper side. I come at it from a data perspective, really. So where I sit is the studies that I would consider kind of the building blocks of how you would build an argument to change something. If something needs to be changed, right? We need to show what the problem is, where there's a problem, and use that information then to be actionable somewhere. So that takes many guises. I mean, I do work. Some of it is just showing where these pollutants are, and there's no question in the United States that environmental toxicants unduly expose disadvantaged people in this country. They absolutely suffer from that more. But there is data that has to back that up, right? So that's the research needs to be done to put it on paper and say, yes, these exposures are occurring here, and then we can figure out what we sort of need to do about that, right? I do a lot of work on the health effects of different environmental toxicants, saying we have neurological problems, we have cardiovascular problems, whatever the outcome might be. Here's the evidence base to say, yeah, lead is a problem. Okay, lead, we have a long history with it, we know that a lot about that, but there are a lot of new things coming up, and we're always sort of trying to figure out what's going on, what's a problem. And I view that as seeing that as kind of the stepping stone to move on to action and saying, where do we go? I interact with EPA a lot. I work with them, or they use my kinds of papers, or people like these kinds of papers to set regulations and things of that sort. There have been some tremendous success stories, like getting lead out of gasoline and paint that has dropped average blood levels in this country by orders of magnitude. But I guess now pulling on where I see kind of injustices, Dr. Reynolds mentioned hearing Needleman speak, I guess, right? So if we're on the topic of lead and flint, I mean, so from my mind, from the data perspective, where I see the injustice is that there are huge, power and representation kind of, forces lined up against those who might want to change the distribution of exposure to health effects. Herbert Needleman is like the shining example of this, in that his career was, largely torpedoed and attacked, and he spent the end of his career battling the forces that were trying to discredit everything he was doing. So lead, we've known since before BC that lead is bad for us and bad for the brain. And it's taken a hell of a long time to actually, take that information to heart. And all the work that was done, I mean, we've known even in the US more recently, from the early 1900s, that it did tremendously bad things for people working in the lead and gas plants. But yet when Herman Edelman comes out and says, these people, and it's overly burdened on the poor and disadvantaged in this country, are having problems from lead, he was attacked mercilessly by industry, who was trying to discredit his research, and it took years to actually now get to a place where more or less everybody believes that lead is a problem. But so I view that as a huge injustice, and it happens extremely today, and the sort of insidious ways that the forces lined up against the kind of stuff I do try and discredit what we do. So, and it's as simple as sort of getting somebody to just write some paper in a pay-for publication type of journal to say something opposite to what I say. And who cares if it would be ripped apart in a traditional peer review process? They've seeded doubt out there, and now they can start to say, well, the scientific community isn't in consensus about this, which they do ad nauseum with climate change, right? So they do this with everything. I've had it happen to me directly in some air pollution work that I've done. And so I view that as a tremendous injustice, and it relates, so that's just a basic there, but it does also relate to this issue that also Dr. Reynolds referred to about precautionary principle, right? Because it also relates to what are our policies in this country. In this country, we basically work on, unfortunately, in the environmental realm, innocent until proven guilty. And so these companies can put anything out there, and then it's up to us to say, whoa, wait a minute, there may be some problem there, and then we try and fix it if we can later. Europe doesn't do that. They have a much more, they work much more on the precautionary principle, where it's a much higher bar to get something out of the market to first show that there's really no harm. Maybe they make some mistakes in doing that, but at least they're setting a bar higher than we do here. So the injustice of attacking the science is also related to the overarching policies of the country.
Okay, thank you. I know we just got a taste of hearing you guys together as a panel, but I have a million questions I'd like to ask, and hopefully later we'll have a little more time, but I'm thinking it would be a really good moment for people to hear from you in a little more depth in our one-on-one sessions, in our breakout groups. And I'm looking at Sophie in the back. Do people have numbers?
So there are numbers that are facing sort of sections.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will explain this briefly, but what we're going to do is we're going to break out the room and actually have 4 different small group conversations. So one way this might work is even centered around some of these circular tables, but we're going to invite our panelists into a group, and I think, so we're just going to kind of have you stick with the number where you're sitting right now. And so to explain a little more, so the group, and 1 is there, right? So group 1 with Leilani is going to be speaking around access to natural resources and its conservation efforts, and indigenous hunting and fishing rights, and a lot of what Leilani started to articulate on the panel. Our second group, which is really the folks kind of behind this number right here, is going to be with Seth Magnin, speaking really especially about the work in Puerto Rico, climate refugees and these rebuilding efforts. Our third group is going to be with Heather, and really speaking to the intersectionality of poverty, government, and the environment. And our fourth group, our academic paper group now, with Dr. Reynolds and Mark Weiskopf.
I will disappoint on that.
Well, no. We'll speak a little more. We're actually going to focus a little more on the Flint water pollution crisis. And if you're sitting in a group and you're thinking, man, but I really wanted to hear about that other one, I would actually encourage you to stay where you are for now, because we're going to have a chance to come back and share our learnings as a group. And so this is each of the presenters is going to take that information, and hopefully some really great conversations are going to come out of that. And I do want to leave you guys with a framing question before we go into the group, because I asked them about challenges, right? I asked our panelists about challenges and injustices, and this group, there's lots where the conversation will go, but I want to frame it by asking you all to think about what are some of the promises and the solutions, what are some glimmers of hope you can identify in these issues and these areas. So I think I just want you to take that question with you as you go into that group, and being able to really think about who are the key players, who are the key institutions, the laws, the challenges, the policies that make this all happen. And we'll give you about 20-ish minutes or so. We'll kind of gauge the time in these small groups. But if that sounds good, I'll invite our panelists to actually head sort of towards those numbers, and we can help direct you. And then we'll come back together in a little bit.
I moved actually up, I think. I'm pretty sure. It should be a little left hand.
Like, go turn around.
I don't know, like, I don't know where on the way.
Okay, we're number 2.
I was not ready.
She was just telling me about how you were like catching up.
Like, yeah. Ronnie, you want to go? It's like I'm just going to slide over to the group anyway.
I think this one's right. Here, I'll just
Okay. Yay, yay. Can everybody hear me? I'm assuming okay. Is it okay if I sit? I'm assuming. All right. So great, wonderful, exciting. Who's running for office to fix all of these things? So you could, I don't want to reiterate anything because we already have 20, we only have 20 minutes. What are promising steps forward and solutions that we can identify, and who, what are key stakeholders, institution, laws, policies, and challenges? I'll start off by saying that, coming from a government background, to me, key areas and stakeholders are your constituency groups, people that are actually on the ground that you have to get involved and engage, and to identifying a solution. And we're just at such an interesting yet critical time, because while nationally our government is really looking to move away from some of the climate conversations we're having. The U.S. has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. There's a lot of movement to deregulate sections of environmental policy. On the other side of that, we're seeing this really big surge. For example, youth involvement with the Sunrise Movement, Green New Deal. A lot of people really engaged and activated in trying to figure out what are we going to do moving forward. So it really creates an interesting balance. When I think about impoverished communities, I often think about the fact that we have a lot of preparedness to work on and sort of catching up, because just on a purely logistical, communities right now, based upon their demographics, their vulnerability to climate issues, and their access to climate and sustainability solutions, are in a place where, as extreme weather continues to come to our country, they get pushed further and further to come. So this is you seeing Miami and the Miami Beach part of Miami continue to rebuild after they have a hurricane, but the folks who live in the Black community or the Haitian community or the Latino community, they can't. It's where you physically go in and you see some places have green spaces that are coming back, and other places don't even have sidewalks or sewage at this point. So there's a huge imbalance there. The other imbalance I think that we don't talk about enough is what are we doing on the solution, renewable energy, clean energy side, right? Who's talking about creating economic opportunities, jobs, sustainability, and making sure that even the communities that are most vulnerable still have access to clean and renewable energy? Who's making sure that when we talk about putting solar panels on housing projects, that it's actually being done, and then it's being done, and people who live in these places are being trained to do this work? You have a lot of, you see a lot of conversation, in poor communities where We're teaching people to be doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, but we're not teaching people to be industrial engineers. We're not teaching them how to take advantage of what's happening in the climate movement that we're seeing right now. So these are just some of the issues that come up on a regular basis. When we talk about sustainability, when we're talking about environmental change, climate policy, and the space that I work in now with mothers, it's really unique because I'm talking to people who are not only concerned about their children's health, they're concerned about their children's future. You know, it's more than just, you know, my child has asthma and he needs to breathe. It's what is my kid going to be doing in the next 12 to 14 years? What kind of job is he going to have? What are the economic opportunities? Where do I need to be sending my child to school? What are they studying? So, you know, engaging mothers in this conversation is really engaging a group of people that we know are voters across this country. We know are very concerned about their children's future and their welfare, but also can be empowered and can, you know, be pulled together to make some positive change.
In Puerto Rico,
So that's some of the fun stuff that I
challenges
get to
that
do.
are there,
Now I want to
and I
throw it out
liken
to you
it
guys,
to
is
New
what
Orleans
you
in many
think
ways,
are
because you had
sort of solutions
years of
and
decline
steps
in
and
out
questions.
migration and
I
slum,
had a question.
blight,
So you emphasized action,
homelessness. There were lots
taking
of problems
action, and not just the
before, and then
research,
hurricanes
moving into
hit that way.
solutions.
But
But
in the case of Puerto Rico,
Get the
what you will
feeling
see a lot in
in
the papers
academia that
also
people are
is,
constantly
you know,
saying,
the
action, act, do something.
negative articles
But in reality,
about
what does that mean?
financial
How,
aid.
what does that
And
look
that
like
has
for people?
impacted the
People are just
recovery
constantly telling
significantly because
you to act,
FEMA is
but
not
it's hard to actually
quick to make
understand what
obligations. HUD has
is the
all
action
these
that you do,
restrictive
but
controls
it
on
feels
the
very broad
funds
coming at you.
that are
That's a good
additional
question,
hurdles
and
that
it
Texas
is a lot
doesn't have to
on
deal
it.
with, Florida
Drinking
doesn't
out of
have to deal
fire
with it,
hose.
Louisiana doesn't have to deal with it, all these other
So I
jurisdictions
think
don't
that
have to
it's
deal
important to recognize
with
that
these
there is that
additional
sort of
barriers.
stark, oh my God, there's this huge problem with
And they already
it too.
have an
But always
infrastructure
think
in
about
terms of
it
their
in the
government
framework
that is
of,
established
can somebody
to be able
take
to
my
manage
work
this process.
and
So
put it
what
to
is
use
being
in the
asked of Puerto
community?
Rico?
So that's
is
how I
just-
think about academic research, even
As,
both when
as
I
I
was
think it
doing it
relates
and
to
when I was implementing.
environmental injustice,
Can
how
I
we
work and
define that, I
partner
think is
together
something
with
we can
somebody
talk
at
about.
a university or
But
a
because
college
of the
and have they
colonial
narrowed their idea
relationship
to
with
the
Puerto
point
Rico,
that I
I
can take
see,
that
I see
idea,
that whole
see
dynamic,
if
and
it
this
works,
is
and come
built
back
upon
and
the
say,
extraction
this
of
is good,
resources and
this
where
needs to
it's
go back
designed.
to
It's
the
based upon its
I think that
value
as we think
as
about our
a
research and
essentially a
our
raw materials
connectivity
producer.
with the communities that
And
we
the
serve,
conversion
or thinking
of
of it
property
from
to
a
industrial
framework of
agriculture
being
and the loss of land rights, and
then
then trying
it's,
to switch
it's,
back
we
to
can take it
give
sort
people
of
land rights. I mean, this is a process
each
that
benefit
unfolded
one
over
by
time, but
one.
that was based upon that colonial relationship, and that still exists in terms of Puerto Rico. And how that manifests now is there's no representation. Puerto Rico they don't have the ability to, I mean, they can lobby, right, but it's a different dynamic than having congressional members. You don't have people necessarily that are able to just call up somebody at FEMA or go over to FEMA headquarters and say, hey, look, we need a policy change. And so we've been working, for example, we've been working on a policy change. To do something that's like super smart for both FEMA and HUD to get together, but FEMA doesn't want to do it because it's not the
And
state
I was going
procedure.
to schools
It would save the American taxpayer money, it would shorten the recovery timeline, it would increase the delivery of benefits to Puerto Rico, but FEMA doesn't want to do it. FEMA is not going to get pressured to do it because they don't
And
have,
I often felt
Puerto Rico doesn't have a coalition, and they don't have votes in
because
Congress.
I felt
And that was
what I was
something
teaching
that was
them
discussed if you were in the Puerto Rico
wasn't
panel,
their-
just the importance of
really cared about,
what happens when you have a voting bloc
not
that
something
aligns
that
with
they
other states in
had the
recovery,
resources to put
and
in
how people come
action.
together, and it doesn't have to do with party lines, because if you vote for something that
and I
impacts
wonder,
Texas,
I feel
they're
like
going to vote for you,
education
right?
around
And something that impacts Puerto Rico and vice versa in California. So
so needed.
I just said a lot of things there, but I think of environmental justice in that way too.
Communities
And it's essentially based upon,
and around like the
I guess it's different ways. There's the built environment,
and be like,
also
yeah, there's
environment.
hurricanes, but it's not affecting me.
What I think of in some
And like,
ways as the,
what am I gonna do? What is like throwing my water bottle in the
how would I
recycling?
define
How is that going to
it was
change?
kind of like when we were all talking about, we all
You
come
know,
from different
so
backgrounds, how do we
that's
define
one big
environment?
thing is like, how do we make it applicable
In my
to
current
everyone,
context,
like to
current
these
context is
communities, and how do we
in many
define
ways political, because that is impacting our
when
ability to quickly
their primary
deliver benefits.
concern
I
is
mean,
are they
I
going
can
to
certainly
get
give you
dinner
examples
and
of
where are they
how
going
the
to
government shutdown
that was
impacted
like
our
my big like
recently. But
that's my big
that,
Very
so
good
anyway,
one.
the
Well,
comment
you know,
about
we see it a
border
lot
wall
of
too,
times
like
where
what that shutdown is about and how that
a lot of
has to do
people
with
who are coming into the Mississippi Delta and saying, you know, hey,
But we
I
see,
am
yeah, I'll I'll stop
coming
there.
from a very
I just said a lot of
different
things.
place and I want to come in here and help. And one of the first things we stop and tell people is, first of all, realize that wherever you're coming from, leave that outside. Understand that cultural competency has to be a part of this work. And with environmental issues, you have to look at it from the lens of the people in which you're working with. So it is a very, very valid issue when you have communities that say, okay, I know you want to come in here and talk to me about environmental issues, but I need a job. We dealt with that a lot in Atlanta. There's a part of Atlanta, right outside of BPA headquarters, we overlook it, where huge environmental issues because it's the watershed for downtown. So all of the water from downtown Atlanta past the wonderful place where you saw the Super Bowl held and all that. Right on the other side of that is black community where you have the AUC, the Atlanta University Center, you've got Spelman Morehouse School of Medicine, you've got a historic African American community there that has been there for years. All of the water and trash drain into that community. So for years, this particular community has said, we are tired of dealing with Atlanta's garbage and trash. Our sewers overflow, it's a problem. We go into work in that community where there's dilapidated
I think
housing,
there's a
burnouts.
couple parts to that.
The people were coming up to me and saying, you know, Heather, it's nice that you're here,
on the Hud
but we
side,
need a job.
how
Can you do something about these burned
typically
down
how you
houses
have to
over here?
focus, and
I'm here
HUD
to
lays
work
out
out and talk about
in what's called a Federal Register notice. So when they make, Congress makes an
So I had to
appropriation,
stop.
there's a Federal Register notice that tells you
Refocus
you have
my
to spend
lens from the
X
point of
percentage
view
of dollars in which jurisdictions,
So
right? So
their
the most
first thing
impacted,
they
so they've
see
already
when
done the
they walk out
analysis
is
based
the
upon who was
burnt
most
down
impacted
houses,
and
that's the
where you
problem
have to
in
spend the money,
community. Then
and
we're
then
gonna
the
come together
percentage
as
of
a
money that has to
community, talk
benefit low and
about
moderate
how are
income
these
persons. So there are
burnt
these
down houses
thresholds.
impacting
Now, there's a
how we
lot
live
of
in
gray
this
area in there.
How are these
Those are
burnt
the
down
overarching
houses
guidelines,
impacting
but then
the
how you
environment
target
in
and
which we're
determine
in?
what's called
Does
methods
it
of
impact the
distribution,
water?
that's where it's
Yeah,
up
it
to
does,
the
'cause
local
believe it or not,
jurisdiction
when there are
to
fire
do
hydrants that come
the
in
research
here
and the unmet
they're
needs
spraying
analysis
their
and say,
foam
okay,
stuff that has
you know,
PFOA and
if we
PFOS
say
in it, that's
in,
possibly
you know,
going
this
into your
county
water
or
system. That's a conversation.
in Puerto
We
Rico,
begin
for
to
example, if you
change the
say, well,
lens of
in
the
the whole
conversation
island is
into
considered
one that the
the
people
most
who are there
impacted,
can
so it's not the same,
understand
but
and
if you use
that very
California
same
as
community
an
that I
example,
talked about that
you
had
know, there
us,
were multiple
standing
counties
there
that were
like, I
considered
don't know
most
why
impacted,
y'all
but
are
then
here.
most damaged.
Right now
This is from
today,
not the last
they
round of
have their
wildfires,
own
but the previous
community
round,
organization
where
where
the city of
they
Santa
have
Rosa,
utilized EPA
if you
funding
saw
to put
that
in
one neighborhood of
playground,
Coffee Park,
green
it was like
spaces.
4,000
They take
homes,
children from the
basically.
community and we taught
It was
them how to
entirely
do their
destroyed.
own
Now
water
that was where
testing
the
and
most
their own
damage
water
was.
body
Now there
ways
were
there.
a lot of counties that
Because we made it
experienced
fun.
damage,
We talked
but the
about
most
the fact
concentrated
that,
damage, so
you know,
that
if you get out
basically
here and do
determines
this, this is one of the
by
ways to
HUD's
help clean
rules,
up all
you
the
know,
trash
where
and stuff that's in
the
and around
investment
these
has to
spaces.
go, but how that money
I'll
is
also
spent
say that it is not
is up
done
to,
overnight. Another
there's
big
some real
problem
gray
with
area
working
in there, right? So is it gonna be, are we just
and
gonna do a
vulnerable
single family housing
populations
program?
is that we
Is
tend
that
to have
really
a
gonna meet the
parachute.
needs of,
Right, we want to
of
come
the
in,
people?
fix
Or
the
if we
problem,
do something
and
that's
then
more
believe
mixed
that people
use,
there are going to be
mixed
able to do
income,
it, and then move on
different
to the
housing
next.
typologies, it might not be what they want, so
When in
that's where the
reality, the
decision
people
making
who are
comes
in the community
and
that we're trying to work in are saying,
and
you're not from
it's
here,
not,
we
it's
don't
not always a
trust you,
clean
we don't know
process
that you're going
because,
to stay
you
here
know,
and be
what
here, so, you
some
know,
people
thank
want
you, come in, bring in your $20,000,
and
$30,000.
that are most vocal is not necessarily
So,
what the long-term needs are,
establishing
right? And so,
trust
I
and
think, you
understanding
know, in terms of
cultural
how the municipal boundaries fall and how you define community was part of your question. And one of the things we recognize in that intersection of those political boundaries and like what is an actual border versus how a watershed is, or how a fire doesn't respect the border, right? And watersheds don't respect our political boundaries. But we don't plan that way traditionally.
And they're volunteers
And
with
so
us, they're working with
there's
us,
a lot of new
but it is a
thinking, like
long-term
Houston
relationship,
is a great example
not
of
just a
where they
short
didn't
come in,
do a
come
lot
out.
of
And that's another
comprehensive
sort of
watershed
shift we have to
planning.
do.
Louisiana
part
as
of the
well
solution
is doing a statewide
is
watershed
when you get
planning
people
approach right now.
that are associated
but
there, that are really
planning in the
rooted
back
around it, and then begin to
is
try to
sometimes
turn
referred
every
to,
single
and you're
thing
looking at only your political
into
boundaries.
an
I just want to get the water out of my jurisdiction as quick as I can.
That's what we have to do. Because
Once it
everything
gets out of my jurisdiction, I don't care what happens
whether
down there.
believe it or not.
But not thinking
I
like, you know,
can
water
throw out a topic, healthcare,
flows
we talk
downhill
about
and somebody else is going to be impacted.
education.
And that was the 2016 floods in Louisiana.
And what
And
I
that
would
was
hear all
why
the
they're,
time,
that is
job
why they're
development.
doing
Well, guess
a
what?
statewide
There's
watershed
an opportunity to teach
effort
people
now, a
how
watershed
to
study. But because the
take
2016
advantage of
floods, and you guys
sustainable
probably don't
jobs. One more
remember
example, then
these,
we'll go to that
maybe
question.
you do. But this was around
In
Baton
Spartanburg,
Rouge,
Tennessee,
Central
in
Louisiana.
Spartanburg,
That time the
South
third biggest
Carolina,
disaster in the country.
they had an
Nobody really knew
amazing
about because it
project,
was a rain event, right? It
community community of color,
concentrated rain
right next to a
for
brown
like
fields, they
8 to
used
10 hours,
a
and it
grant
was
in order to train
flooded out this area around East Baton
train
Rouge.
the
and
community
Denver
on
Springs
how
Central,
to
which is
install
around,
solar
above
panels,
Baton Rouge.
right? So
But
this
then
was
that
this was
created
the
this
training.
backwater
It was
flooding
the training
that
on
then
how to
traveled out
install
to
solar
Lafayette.
panels, how to do
Like a week
housing.
later, it flooded people out over there,
Specifically
right?
targeting a group of people who
But
did not
at
have
that
an
time, it was the
education
third biggest
to a
disaster.
very specific field
That didn't
that
have a
we
name,
knew
it
was
wasn't a named
burgeoning,
storm, it
right?
wasn't a celebrity
So
storm, it wasn't sexy.
now this
It was a
group,
big rain
if
event
you
that
go and
flooded a
just
lot of people.
research it
And
and look up
and it
Spartanburg,
didn't
South
follow,
Carolina,
you know, any
you'll
political
see through
boundaries.
the
But
Regenesis project.
I think
it
to
took
answer
something
your
like
question, I think how we
$300,000
get better, and this has to
leverage it
happen
into $3 million because the people
at the state
who were
level,
in
but
the
it has to happen
community
between states
learned
too,
how to
especially
do
when you
a
have
skill. They
in
needed
Shelby
a
County,
job.
Tennessee,
We
you have
taught
three
them
states
a
coming
job.
together,
They had to
and that's
do
where Memphis is, if you guys know that intersection.
That has now multiplied.
If you're planning
because
in a
not only were
vacuum,
they able to put that
because, you know,
solar panel
there are
on
multiple
those
states coming together,
houses
multiple
that
waterways, you know,
are now
railroads, all these
educating
things, but if
and
you're planning in a
empowering
vacuum just around
low-income
your little
people,
municipality, like, what does that mean, right?
with a
I
job
think
that
that
we know we need in the
we talk a lot about, you know, working in silos
sorry.
in government, and, you know, this is something I experience every state, every county that I work in, is working between agencies. So it's not just, you know, at the local level, working up to the, you know, county level, working up to the state level. But even at the state level, and this is, as I mentioned with the FEMA and the HUD not working together, because, you know, you're looking at, in Puerto Rico, 50 billion on the FEMA side and 20 billion on the HUD side. We're not talking about any funds from EPA, we're talking about any funds from Army Corps of Engineers. But for FEMA and HUD to try and work a little bit better together, it's crazy. And this is at the federal level, like, at how it is. So, you know, thinking about, like, the solutions that we can identify is
But it's, I feel like with
I
environmental.
think better integration on some of the strategic areas. In particular, it's around the mitigation and the planning. And I mean, I'll give you an example, and this is the environment in which we operate. Right, we have a planning effort under our HUD program. There's a hazard mitigation planning effort under the FEMA program that are doing similar but separate things. They're funded in separate ways. There are different groups involved. We don't necessarily, you know, and at the end of the day, we don't know. We know what their outcomes are supposed to be. They know what our goals are, but we're not necessarily synced up. And so if you live in a community
It's
and
a fight
you're
we're
getting an
in
invitation to
regularly.
go to a meeting,
Right
and
now,
because, you know, we push participatory planning, right? Getting inclusionary planning, getting people involved, getting people to be involved in what happens in your community.
Mercury and air toxic standard or the MAT score.
But how do you
Which is
discern
basically
what meeting you should go to?
how we started,
How do you
our
know?
organization started. And
You
even
don't.
coming from
And
the
ultimately,
VA,
you get tired of
what we
going to
worked
meetings
on
and
quite
not seeing
a
results.
bit
And that's
to make
one
sure
of the
there's a
things that we
mechanism
battle,
in place.
because the timeline.
The simplest way I can explain it is this, and I say simple for
funds
me,
two
not for
people
you.
in two communities to see those investments. People get worn out and they
Is,
get tired.
you know,
And then what
the
happens
federal
is,
government required all the
many
industries
cases,
to put in sort of a
if
scrubber
there's
to
a,
ensure that the
you know,
mercury
greener
that's coming
pasture,
out
they're going
of
to go
these
to it. And
plants
so
in terms of air
that causes
pollution
community decay.
is captured.
People
so that
leave,
you don't
people
have
abandon
mercury that's
properties,
going
and
into
so
the air.
that's something that
Mercury is something
in New
that
Orleans certainly
if it gets
there were
into
conscious efforts,
Fetus
and there's
area
still, you know, there's
completely,
still portfolio
something we
properties
know
that the
that
city
totally
owns that they're still trying to
inhibits brain
unload the hot
development
next door
in fetus.
program, but it creates
So
checkerboard
it's very
communities.
important that we are not breathing
So it's something that,
or
you know, we're conscious
ingesting
of
this
and we're
poison.
concerned about,
So
certainly in
when
Puerto Rico,
EPA
but
decided in about November of
that, I think
2018
from a
that they wanted
a,
to change or
you know,
look at the
planning
rules
level,
on mercury, of course, we immediately
speeding up the recovery timeline is
because
something that I see in better
so far, the
synchronicity
industries
between the
that we're
agencies.
aware of
I don't even know if I
already
answered your
done a
question,
great
but
job of ensuring
hopefully
that
there
they
was
have
something
these
there that you
scrubbers
could think of.
on their
Chew on,
plants. It makes no sense whatsoever to tell them that they don't have to do it or to trust that they're going to do it. It's like me telling my 2-year-old, you know, there's a cookies on the table, don't touch the cookies, and he's walking out of the room saying the kid's not going to touch the cookies. I'm stupid if I think that my 2-year-old is not going to go grab the cookies, all right? Same scenario. We're saying, you know, that, hey, companies,
Yeah,
it's
so,
okay,
and
we
I
trust
didn't
you, we
want
know you're going to do the
try and
right
usurp that
thing.
panel,
We're just
but
going to walk away and not look at it.
that
We are actively
was
engaging
inaccurate. HUD has
mothers
approved the
across
action
the
plan
country to
for
step
1.5
up
billion.
to say, hey,
The
this
action
is
plan
not
for the
acceptable.
substantial amendment to the
And
action
to
plan
some
for
extent,
8.2, the additional 8.2 billion is
well.
on HUD's desk right now.
Very vocal and
And because of the shutdown, they issued 2 more federal notices to delay it. But those processes,
that are right there
and
on
so,
Capitol
and I
Hill,
understand
sitting in
what
hearing rooms.
what she was saying
and
also.
it's beginning to make a difference
And
because
there were
we
multiple
were
parts
there
to
and we
it,
were
but
talking about this.
she was
issue
incorrect
with
in that
the,
it wasn't approved by HUD
appointment
and
of
that it
Andrew
wasn't,
Willer as
and
the
it didn't
new
go through public
EPA
process.
administrator. So
And
we've
it
been
went
really
through
pushing
public
back
meetings,
on that with
and it
this
went through
MAT
public comment
issue
period,
as sort of the
and
forefront. And
HUD
believe it or not,
signed
there
off on
are
it and
Republican
approved it,
senators
as
who
did,
started questioning and saying,
folks in Puerto
well, what are you going to do with
there
this?
are
Are you going to consider
what I think
this
some
particular
groups
rule? So much so that we saw where
want
EPA
and what
started
they
saying,
submitted
hey, we
public comment
didn't say
on
we were going to do that.
they wanted
That is
to
the
see
type of
like
advocacy
a much longer public
work
comment
that
period.
people have to know
And if you
that
do
your
that, and that's not to say that like the door is closed on public comment. Like, public comment comes in all the time. There is a regulated mandatory public comment period that the Federal Register notice dictates. And the most recent,
You
we went
immediately
for a
pick
full
up,
30
first thing you
days.
do is you pick up your
And
phone.
the group in particular, that
and you
if
call
you'll
your
read the
senator.
article in NPR or
And
on
you
Hill,
tell
the
them,
group is Ayuda Legal, right? And so they're a legal
hi,
advocacy
Senator
group.
such and such,
And
this
they
is
were
a
very
problem.
important
Are
in
you
helping
going to
people
allow this to
in,
continue to
with
happen
the
in your
FEMA
district? That's number one. And
applications.
after you call
And
him or her,
they're-
you call both of
they
them.
would like to see a
You
much
call the
longer
people in your
public
state
comment
and you
period.
call the mayor.
The
You
longer you
start
go,
there.
the longer it takes to
Enough
start
people do
programs.
not
I mean,
hold
the
elected
hurricane happened in
officials accountable, pure and simple.
September
Okay, so
2017.
you do that, and then you go get 5 friends to do
February
that. And then here's
2019.
the next thing.
The
that you
HUD
have
money is
to
the
do.
last money to come
Hit
in,
them on
but
social
it's the
media.
first money that's going to get spent.
Social media
But
is one of
if
the
you
biggest
go to public
platforms
comment
that has become
and continue,
one
and
of
this
the
is,
biggest
again, not to say
avenues
that
of peace
the input isn't
access.
important,
Thanks in
because
part to our
participatory and inclusionary part is absolutely, that's like what I enjoy
administrator.
most, is
Have
engaging
your
with
thoughts
stakeholders.
by that time.
But
But
at a certain point in
there's
time,
sometimes
you have to push
statistics
forward,
on us.
and you're not
No,
gonna
Tweet at
satisfy
them.
everyone
They will
at
respond to
every
you
point in
faster
time.
on
And one of her comments, I
than
think,
Alberta.
and how it responds
And it's
to
the
community
reality,
planning
but
piece
it's
in
what it
particular.
is. So, I hope that people
If there's a
who are,
misunderstanding of
she
that
said,
program,
common
the
everyday
community resilience
citizens
planning
don't
program,
feel
it's
like, oh, I'm
through the
hopeless,
substantial
and they have one of these in their hands. Because
group
this
that
can be
is
one of the most
the
powerful tools
project
ever
manager is
when
the
we learn
foundation
how to
for it.
use it.
And
That's
as
one of
a
the reasons why I'm
nonprofit,
really super excited about
they
young
can be
people in this
an
movement,
administrative
because my
entity,
2-year-old
essentially an
can work my
implementation
phone
partner,
better than I
subrecipient.
so, the
There are
fact
multiple
that they are
subrecipients.
engaged and that
This is
they're
the Department of
constantly
Economic
in
Commerce, and this
this
is
place
probably
of
more
social media, of
technical and
intimate
wonky than you guys know
interaction
about.
with one another.
But just in terms of like how the money flows to HUD, it makes the Department of Housing grants it, or Department of Housing then makes determinations, on which other government agencies can help run programs. So the Department of Economic Development and Commerce, they're gonna run, like $800 million
I had
economic
never
development,
been
like different programs, business
to
incubators,
testify for
they run
any.
workforce development, small
And
business
when we
financing.
started up
and,
8 years ago,
run a tourism and marketing campaign, but they're going to be in charge of that portfolio. There
It was
is
Lisa.
Lisa
the
Jackson.
Housing Finance Authority that's
And,
doing the low-income housing tax credit
but it was
program.
Clean Comprehensive.
They're also going to do a mortgage catch-up program. So there are different partners,
And
Spanish Puerto Rico, the
I
manager for
wrote my
community planning,
testimony as a mom.
whole community resilience planning,
Granted,
but
I
they are
am
not
the editorial
dictating
director
plans. All they are doing is bringing their convener and helping with community outreach, getting people to the table, getting the right nonprofits involved at the local level, getting the right government agencies involved. They're not writing plans, they're not dictating plans. They're a project manager for the plan. There's a misunderstanding of what it is they're doing. There's also
1% was
frustration
industry,
because
and they were
people didn't
so
understand, well, why is the
outnumbered
foundation
that they were
selected
very neat,
to
and
run
you
this
felt
program,
very
to be the
empowered.
program manager?
And
Why a
anybody can
foundation?
go do that.
Well, the reason is that a foundation has a different interaction with the community.
And that's what we do.
A nonprofit
We
has a
bring
different interaction
moms
with the community
and
than a
we bring
government
moms and we
entity.
bring kids
Government entities in
in.
Puerto Rico
And
don't
so
have a
that the
good track
kids can
record
actually
of
see
interacting with
this
communities in a
democracy
meaningful
in
way, and there's a
happening
distrust
in
of government.
action.
So the
Now,
idea was,
we've
let's
got a lot
have
of money
a foundation be
going
involved.
in,
And this is not to say like
if your
it's a
pocketbook
foolproof
is
process,
not gonna
but
be enough.
the
Just
LA
like,
Safe project that I worked on, which is
recycling is
Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future
it's gonna
Environment. We
take
had the
these big
Foundation for Louisiana
movements, like what's going
to
on.
the Office of Community Development.
Anyway,
And, then we had
keep going.
the Coastal Fishermen's Group, and we had, other consulting entities, but we had a team of
It's
people, but the
interesting that
foundation
the,
being involved gave a different level of
what we're
credibility to the
seeing
effort. It
continue
was
to
still led by
grow.
the state, or
On its
overseen by the
face, some
state, but
people
having the
think it's
foundation
cute,
out
right?
front to interact
We
with
walk
communities
into a hearing room
had a different,
with a mother and
had
some
a totally
kids,
different vibe
and
to
we're
it,
like,
right?
oh,
And
it's
so
so
there
nice,
is
so cute of you
frustration
all to
though,
bring your children
and
here.
I will acknowledge that, I will absolutely
And immediately,
discuss with her
the
the merits
impression
of the decision.
is that these
It's
are
not
just
my
moms
decision.
coming on a field trip with their
But
children.
I will defend it in that
One of
it
the things
makes
I'm
sense
most
to
proud
have
of
a
is that
non-governmental
we
entity
put our moms in a position to sort of own those
participatory
things.
planning to compete
So
with
they
other
are
nonprofits
extremely,
because they are
extremely
seen in a much different way and they have a
well-read and
different level of
researched
engagement with the
and can
community.
talk about
But
issues from a
There
scientific
is
and a data
there
perspective.
was
I've
frustration
seen some others
with how that
literally,
decision was
with
made
an
because
arm
everybody
lady go to
end of the day, and I can tell you,
the
like, I'm
Senate
in
and Senate
meetings
staff because
with,
they're armed with the research
Rockefeller's
and they're
100%
armed with the
cities and
knowledge.
like a whole group of
And that's the
stakeholders and enterprise
value
community partners
that
and their work.
comes with
There are all these groups that are coming together
that's the
with
value
different,
of having
whether
good solid
it's,
research. You should
activist
know
groups,
going
legal
into
entities,
somebody's hands
but everybody
is saying
wants to understand how
to
they
that
get
particular
involved. And
person,
essentially
No.
how they get a
I
slice
can
of the
tell you
recovery pie.
that based upon
put it
this
very bluntly.
research, this is the number of people
And
and
because
children
like
that
the
live
money is
in your
like not
district
flowing yet,
that are
because
impacted
HUD
with this
has again, as I
particular,
mentioned, a lot of
that are
restrictions.
impacted by
Now
that. And as a result of
started
these
work
numbers,
on the
these very
cost,
specific numbers
but
that are coming,
there's frustration
or that
because
have been
everybody thinks
measured
that,
from the air pollution
well,
monitors that we
this
have
happened in this
located,
jurisdiction,
this is
so
the
we should be
number
able to
we're
do
getting. So,
this
sir,
jurisdiction.
we need
But the
air
reality
monitors
is,
in this place.
and this is again back to the political environment,
It's
the level
amazing how
of risk
effective that is.
that
So, that's
at the
another.
most senior levels of Washington that are seen in Puerto Rico, there are so many controls. I mean, we have been told that the minute you guys, make your first sizable draw, the auditors would go, like that was what we're told. Okay, what are we going to do? That's the operating environment. But the reality is, they're looking at all the potential sub-recipients, whether it's foundations, whether it's municipios, whether it's other agencies, and looking at that risk, it's $20 billion in Puerto Rico. And the Office of Management and Budget is looking at it and saying, there's a lot of risk there. And they're communicating that, at all levels of the government. So there's so much scrutiny that nothing is going to happen quickly because there's so much scrutiny. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, and that's again, that's the reality. Like to the earlier question, like how do you know what's going on there? Like, also don't take my word for it.
So that's one of the things we do all the time. That's like the main point of our role. We work in hand with the Environmental Defense Fund. So on one hand, we have a good relationship with excellent researchers from around the world that are constantly studying this information. We can even go down the hall to say, what is your input? And then when we're running other people to put it into common everyday terms. That is the key. I will tell you, I've been fighting industry all my life. That's just what I do. There's nothing more effective than putting it into common everyday
climate
life.
change, right?
You've got to be able to take it from a school to a
I live on
church to a grocery
the
store.
coast, and I have
where
a
people are
multi-million-dollar house.
commonly every
I think it's
single
damaged. I'm
day
probably going to
and
rebuild
talk to
it
it
because I
their
can probably
life.
afford to. But if I've lived
I
in
said
a
sort of
coastal
casually,
area,
Southern,
east coast of
but and a
Louisiana,
lot of
the people that
think
could
that in the
afford
South,
to retreat,
how in the world are you
could
going to
afford
convince people in the
to
South that
elevate,
Mississippi is
oftentimes
climate?
did.
You just have to talk about it from a Southern perspective.
And those that could
Because we
not
talk
afford
about
to,
climate, we talk
or
about
that made their
hunting,
living
fishing,
on the
seasons,
water,
and the weather. How do you talk about
they stayed.
the mothers in the
And so
mothers
they were
board and
impacted.
the First Baptist
So,
Church,
in terms
Missionary
of,
Baptist Church? We talk about it for creation
what
care.
we do or
talk
what
about
kind
it
of
in,
policies
what is
and
God
what kind of
requiring
solutions, we
in
might,
terms of caring for our environment.
that was a big
How
part
do
of
you talk about it
the
when you're
LA
out west in
project was,
California?
trying to
We're talking
understand
about
how we look at
conservation.
short, medium, and
We're
long
talking
term,
about it in terms
and
of
how we
what's the next
incentivize
step.
people
Learn
to
the
make those
language
decisions
of people you're
rather than
talking
force them, right? I mean,
and then translate.
it's
A lot
the
of
carrot
times
or the
it's
stick,
translate.
the plato plomo,
Translate
if
the
you
language
guys are
into what
Narcos
the
fans.
people know. And then
But
watch how they
you're going to get a better result when you incentivize and create
We have a
conditions
minute. That's why I was trying to talk so fast, and I was trying to
want
keep up with
to
ideas,
make that
keep
decision
up
but
with sort of
can't
what we talked
or
about
financially able to make that decision.
in terms of our framing
that-
based upon cultural
that is something
competency,
where
taking the data that we receive and making
you have to
it,
create the
putting it
opportunity.
into a space where people can actually
Where you have to
implement
create the
that data,
opportunity for them
and
to
making
still
it
continue to
applicable
have
to what's
access to those
working
things
there,
that are an
and
important part of their
just to sum it
community.
all
And
up,
that's one thing we found in the Like I Said project. I mean, you have to, and with the Illusion Charles, you have to be able to ensure that there is ongoing access and use for
Don't let them give up the fight.
to their relationship with their
And
identity.
call your senators every last one or tweet them.
I'm much more of like a provide an incentive rather than like just create a mandate. This is not Russia, right? Like, and I say that because like there have been articles written like the government wants to come in and do something, they just take the land and they do it. You live in an apartment building, well guess what? Now you live in another apartment building.
Like, go with them.
That's not the way. That's not typically the way that we do things. But it sometimes does happen. I mean, you can't take property in eminent domain. I know we have to wrap up soon. I didn't write anything down. Anybody write anything down? I think I'll go up there and do something. I'm happy to talk afterwards. I'll be there.
Ay, sí, no me gusta. O sea, me pone nerviosísimo. Sí, 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 o sea, mira.
Okay.
How many of you could have kept talking in those groups for another, I don't know, hour or so? Yeah? Well, we don't want to keep you here forever, so I had to pull you out at some point, but I hope that those conversations were just a little sliver more into some specific parts of this work. But I'm actually gonna kind of bring us back, and I want really everyone to get a chance to know what were some of the things that were coming out of these conversations. So we're gonna have a little bit of a debrief, and then at the end of the debrief, we will take some audience questions. So if you do have some burning questions for our panelists, especially someone you didn't get to interact with in the small group, you can start thinking of those, and we'll have time for just a couple at the very end. But I did want to start and ask our group leaders, our panelists, about what some of these conversations really were, and what were some of, I know, I'm sure you talked about a lot, but we were kind of framing with like, what are some hopes, what are some solutions, what are some ideas, and what were some of the things that were sticking out from these conversations that you had about solutions or ideas that you're excited about, or that the participants in your group were happy to talk about? And I think I'll start with this group, and with Mr. Weiskopf, would you like to start, or?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just take that point and we talk at the end. So we had a discussion about various things, large, often around issues of power and where justice comes up. But I'll leave some for Dr. Reynolds to also summarize. But I'll go to that last point in the end where we were talking about hopeful stuff, where we sort of put it actually to the others instead of the two of us about where they saw that. And I think the issue is raised, and I think rightly, I think it's one of the potential for the current way information is shared, and social media and other sources of ways of getting out there, with recognition that there are problems in that, and that we've seen them in many places, but that it offers opportunities to engage a much wider audience and have voices heard that aren't always heard. And that I was saying, I feel like part of the problem is representation, and especially when you're battling deep pockets, big power, and in certain political climates, grassroots may be where it really is at, and part of what feeds that is just more people, more numbers, and a bigger voice, and that these current ways of getting information out and having stories heard and amplifying the voice may be a good place to be able to go. That's a hopeful place where we might be able to make change.
Dr. Reynolds.
Yes, we did, as we were wrapping up, encouraged to wrap up, we did get into a discussion of citizen science and the promises from that, engaging citizens in, well, it does have to be more than just the sampling process, but also the collection, sampling, interpretation of that information, and being sensitive as you listen to find out, what does this information mean to the community with which I'm working? Listening is key. My colleague here touched on this, when basically it boils down to different ways of knowing. And yes, as Dr. Weiskopf said, yeah, we focus sometimes on what we can count, but there's also qualitative things too. So I'll throw in my quick editorial. Nestle's pumps 400 gallons a minute from a place in mid-Michigan. And they say it's not harming the environment. But we have our Native American communities around those sites that they grow wild rice. And that's part of their life, collecting wild rice. It'd be like a holiday for us, or a festival for us, and you're depriving them of that source. Well, you have to be sensitive to the way folks look at how they live
around the room. I'd love to hear from your session, Heather.
So my session has given everyone homework. Every single person in here has an assignment, and the assignment is to call your senator. That is an action item. You know, we talked about what are steps forward and solutions, and something that each and every person can do is you can contact your senator and immediately tell them what you are opposed to. Those things count. They count the number of calls that come in, they count the emails that come in, and I prefer that you tweet or Facebook them, because it's amazing how a 240-character tweet can move a whole body of Congress to do something. Our newest members of Congress have shown us. So if you don't do anything else, nothing else, contact your senator. Tell them to vote against Andrew Wheeler and to vote for Matt. Sorry, okay. That's what that is. So that's one. Two is to have a sense of cultural competency. You know, as you're going into and working in communities, and I think that it sounds like that's a solution that has come across in a number of different groups. Cultural competency is important. Understanding that parachuting in and out of communities when you're talking about and doing environmental work, environmental injustices, just does not work, and that there's an impact that's left on the community when you do that. I think that certainly came out of the conversations that we had, that you need to understand and look through the lens of the community of which you're working, and try to frame questions and solutions through the lens of the people that are there, because it makes it long-standing. It's something that connects those people to the actual solution, and it gives some forward movement to the activity that you're trying to do. So it's one thing to try to go in and teach people how to build or do maybe a community garden. It's another thing to look at it through the lens of if there are vacant properties that people want to see removed from there, and how do you shift those? You know, really looking through the lens of the people that live there. And I think the other is to using our data and calling our question that we're asking in our research down to something specific enough that people can use in the field. So it's taking the research, or it's taking the data and making sure that it's framed in a way that's implementable, and then really working very closely with people who are practitioners to ensure that whatever's happening and whatever they're doing out in the field is actually working. So it's getting that feedback. It's saying, you know, hey, is my data, is my research being effective in this place? If so, tell me what's being effective. If not, you know, what do we need to switch? Because it's people who are actually in the field and in the communities that will give you some validation to your research. And it's a very good practical way to see if what you're working on is actually implementable. Because again, you know, it's the work that happens actually out there in the field that makes the difference. If they can't use it, then it's not helpful to us. So I think those were some really good things that came out of our group. Did I frame that well enough?
Great to hear. Wow,
So I will pick up on that data thing, because I think that touches on a couple things we talked about, and how data impacts policy, and how policy should be something that is living and not stagnant. I don't know if we put it in those terms specifically, but the question came up, you know, is how do we focus or target resources in disaster recovery situations? And I use the example of Hud Funding, and how HUD provides some guidance on what the most impacted and distressed areas are, what they call when there's a disaster. They establish what the percentages of low and moderate income people that have to be served through the expenditure of grant funds. But you know, they may establish some priorities like spend majority on housing. You know, they may not. But ultimately, it's up to the local jurisdiction to do their own analysis and let the data drive the decisions. And it should, but that data should not be stagnant. You use the best available data you can. But to Lawrence's input too, in having that qualitative lens, you should include input from, you know, non-traditional sources, and I should say participatory planning. That was something else we talked about. You know, having an inclusionary process, right? And that's not to say that, you know, a public forum is the only place that you get information, because a lot of times, you know, people are not going to want to come to a public meeting, especially if it's like during the workday or if it's right after work. So finding ways to get that input, you know, whether it's using social media. So as much as disseminating information for gathering information, like what are those mechanisms that we're using to gather information from communities, and for people that aren't online. There are a lot of people that aren't, and this is, you know, in Puerto Rico as an example, you know, something like 80% of people have a smartphone. Puerto Rico, so that's pretty high. But there's still, you know, a significant number of people that are elderly, that are in rural areas, that we need to remember that we need to reach them. You know, one thing that we talked about briefly too, that I'll say that came out as, I think, a solution, is how we better align between agencies. And, you know, we talk about working in silos, and this is down at the local level, you know, at the county, you know, state level, between agencies. At the federal level, in a recovery environment, you know, we are not well aligned currently. And this is an area where we have, I think, opportunity. So for the agents of change in this room that want to do things in the policy space, that want to, you know, get together with FEMA and HUD and find a way to integrate how we are spending literally billions of dollars, you know, between agencies, and how we can coordinate our efforts. The example that I'll use, you know, there's $8.3 billion dedicated to Puerto Rico for mitigation, disaster recovery funding. That's on the HUD side of the house. On the FEMA side of the house, you know, there's $3 billion designated for hazard mitigation funding. Now they sound similar, right? They both have the word mitigation in them. Why are there two separate programs? What do they both have to achieve? How do they work together? Well, the other side of that is there are separate government agencies that run at the local level that run those programs. They have separate rules for the local jurisdictions that are going to apply for those funds. So those are areas where we can, and that's, you know, one of the things that we're working to do, try and get FEMA and HUD to work with us locally. But, you know, to better align at the federal level, and, you know, all the way down to the local level, that's something that, you know, we still fight that every day. The other issue of political and you know, naturally occurring boundaries came up too. You know, how do you define a community that is impacted? You know, and with the idea of a watershed that doesn't follow political boundary, and how communities, you know, may plan around political boundaries but not like the naturally occurring geographies. That's something that I used the example of. You know, Houston was not necessarily planned out with the full watershed in mind. There was lots of different planning efforts that took place, and you know, development in vacuums that didn't take into account the full watershed. And you know, we saw some of the impacts of that recently with Harvey, and they've been truthfully experiencing that in Texas for longer than Harvey. Louisiana, same thing. They're doing like a full statewide watershed approach, but you know, are they working in concert with Mississippi and Texas as well, and other related you know, states? It's just within the state of Louisiana, so it's better. You know, they're moving in the right direction, but I think that's at a policy level how we look at greater planning alignment around things like watersheds, and you know, wildfires obviously also don't respect political boundaries. So, question came up where to go for correct news. So, and I said in my group, and I'll tell all of you, you know, don't take my word for it. Do your research, right? Anything that I say, this is, you know, I'm just one person that represents, you know, myself and you know, my opinions and things that I've seen. And but do your research. Where do you go for the right news? I recommended a couple local news sources in Puerto Rico, but you know, it's not all on CNN. It's not all in NPR. It's not all on Fox. It's not all on, you know, BBC. You know, do your research. You know, I have my Google alerts set for like every possible thing that I could get. So I'm constantly trying to understand, you know, and learn myself from what else is being said and being published. So I won't say that there's one correct source, because there's not. It's got to be a blend, and you have to make your educated assumptions and decisions. But I think I don't know if I got all from my group. Did I miss anything else there? You guys, good? Anything? Got it? Okay.
Thank you so much, and I'd love to hear from Leilani's group.
Great. Well, I guess I'm just really happy to hear that we had similar themes going across all the groups, so it seems like everybody was kind of getting towards some of the kind of thematic solutions to this. I think one thing that came up in our group that I thought was really powerful was the question about solidarity among Indigenous people internationally, especially vis-a-vis large transnational corporations. And I think that the technology point, the idea, the power of social media, and that to kind of build coalitions is a huge boon, at least in regards to organizing for these international kind of solidarity movements. But it's also incredibly challenging, because you have this question of good information. Where do you get good data? Where do you understand like each of these different problems and really know that like this is actually happening everywhere. And that's a question that we have for everything, I think, in regards to environmental issues, is that everything is constantly being questioned. You know, the science, you know, the science of it is constantly being questioned, and so what are the ways of knowing? And I think that Dr. Reynolds' example of the wild rice harvesting is an excellent example of different ways of knowing. And in my own personal examples, it's usually with the amount of fish on the reef is a good way of knowing whether or not the water that's flowing out of the river is polluted or not. And so knowing that, hey, like I'm a person who lives in this community and I don't know how to measure pollutants in water, but I do know that normally there's this much fish on this part of the reef and now there isn't. Like something's wrong there. And we can kind of build off of that on a really local level to create these other ways of knowing and kind of changing the way that we all experience, you know, like we all understand this. And then similarly to that, it's contextual. It depends on each community. And we talked about that a lot, was how do you, as a policymaker, this was a really great question, as a policymaker, what terminologies do you use to make sure that you're not creating more disruption in kind of these like wide sweeping terms? And the one that I focused on was this idea of indigenous, and how do you create a policy about all indigenous people in the US? The answer is you can't. And so I was talking about ways that you can actually just use the tribe's name is a great way to start, but then also you have to get even finer than that in a lot of situations, and you have to really contextualize all of those solutions. And I think finally, more people, more voices. I think that really resounds with me. It's that I think that we've let voice and power in this country get really concentrated. But the fact of the matter is that the basic institutions here empower us to have diversity, empower us to have many voices. And so, everybody being able to call their senator is a huge deal. Like that doesn't exist in other places. And so we should all feel really empowered to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And actually, Leilani, you did an excellent job of really wrapping up but bringing together some of the themes that everyone was sharing, right? And one thing I'm kind of hearing is, well, really, like I heard from all of these, is understanding power, understanding how those most impacted by environmental injustices are also least likely to have their voices heard. So how can we be creative with our solutions in elevating those voices, and how can solutions really be tailored to a local level and to the specifics of a community? I mean, those are the things that really stuck out to me from what you all shared. I want to turn to my audience. We have just a few minutes, but I'd love to take a few broad questions, and I am actually wondering if I could do maybe three questions, if those are in the audience, then our panelists can kind of pick and choose from those to respond to. Does that sound all right? So I have one, yes, you want a question? One, and then two, and is there someone on this side of the room? Three.
So just with like environmentalism being an issue that affects like everyone, since we all like live in the environment and on the planet, but also in the spirit of also recognizing the difference between intent and impact. What can marginalized communities do, or like mechanisms that you might be familiar with, to sort of protect themselves even with the people who might be coming in to help them? Because just like historically we see like large movements often get co-opted or like hijacked, and people usually unfortunately hop off the train once like some of the trickle down starts to hit them. But what are some like mechanisms or ideas you have for like marginalized communities to sort of make sure that even as everyone else leaves, they have control and sort of still like building up those movements and containing like those resources that they were fighting for in the first place?
Great, thank you. And I'll take the second question.
So in doing research and advocacy work, how do you deal with lack of or insufficient data? I think, for example, as grad students, when we do like projects and look at exposure marketing books, there's still gaps here and there. So how do you decide the values to use that are most helpful for the communities you are advocating for or doing research?
Thank you. And then this question.
I wanted to know what you think the role is and how helpful or harmful large environmental organizations have been in terms of actually helping to create policy that is beneficial to everyone and helping people on the ground advocate for themselves.
Great. So I will let, so those are our three questions, right? Our first one on how can marginalized communities protect themselves against those coming to offer help. How do we deal with just the lack of data that's out there? And then this last question on really have larger organizations been helpful or harmful in this process? And so I will open it up to whoever would like to answer really any piece of those questions.
I have a recent history. I just joined the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has a history of being not too considerate of people of color and their needs. However, they have launched an environmental justice initiative. And at least within their national office, but I can answer for the state of Michigan, we have really been trying to put together an environmental justice program and traveling program so that we can go around and talk to people. And I don't expect, I'll just say it bluntly, those who choose to hold on to their privilege and their position will continue to do so. But you're always looking for allies, and you're always looking for an opportunity. And sometimes the members of the organization just go beyond what that board for the national body wants. Because back to that first question, part of the work of environmental justice is organizing, just like any social justice endeavor. We have to be working it in place, not to sound totally pejorative, but when the circus leaves town, all those folks with good intentions, we have to continue our work.
Well, just kind of, I can jump on that a little bit too, because I think that it's almost like you're creating a level of accountability, because you're talking about the marginalized community and how are you ensuring that they're not getting hijacked, right? And this is how are you ensuring the accountability of large organizations and getting involved. So it's getting involved, sounds like at multiple scales. Like if these large organizations are traditionally, super homogenous or, whatever the case is, get involved. At the local level, I think that there has to be that oversight and accountability, and I don't know, is it, from having somebody that sits outside and that is watching what's happening, and I don't know if you have like a specific example in mind, but, I think of, groups that, I saw in New Orleans and that are still in New Orleans to some extent, maybe they didn't represent, and like myself, working with Habitat for Humanity, recognizing I'm an outsider and working, day in, day out in a community of color and making sure that we are, working in a way that is integrated and so forth, but very much recognizing that outfit was comprised mainly of, folks that were not from the community, but taking the steps to bring in other groups from the community and hire locally, because it was a lot of, for all intents and purposes, there were a lot of, white AmeriCorps that were populating that group. And so how does that feel like something that is, part of the community, that's for the community? And then, the staff of that organization working in those communities. So I think, like, when I think of that as like a real example, what is that level of accountability? Who's on the board of that organization? And so, who, I guess, is overseeing that? And so I would say, how do you make sure that, things aren't getting hijacked is, petitioning to, being involved with those types of groups, getting involved, keeping them accountable. But it is, I think, as Dr. Rounds is saying, is, getting involved. If you see something like that is questionable, get involved.
I'm to follow the same conversation. I think it's critical to ask questions and be upfront at the very beginning. At the very, very onset is to be very clear from the community's perspective, what are the expectations, and to ask those questions. What are you expecting the outcome to be? When are you expecting that outcome to be? What are the deliverables? Because everybody has good intentions, but you're right, the reality is at some point the project will end. But if you have a very clear understanding on the front end of what those expectations are, then the community has a better sense of what they're partnering with. And so to phrase and couch it in terms that are important to the community, that this is a partnership, that we're working together, that this will go on for 2 to 3 years, and this is what we're expected to leave behind and what's expected to happen. That is critical in ensuring that the community has ownership of the event or the project, and that they maintain that ownership throughout. And that creates a good cohesiveness such that if at any point in time in the future, the organization needs to come back or can look at it as a good opportunity to showcase what work is being done. Because another thing that often happens is that you have these big groups that come in, and this will go to sort of the big green question as well. And they're coming in and they're working with community, and there are all these photos and pictures that are taken, and those go on the fundraising booklets that go out into other places. And this is how they raise money. And then people in the community are saying, wait, hold a minute, you just had my kid's picture on the front of a brochure so that you can get your $500,000 donors to donate even more money. That's not cool. And that's, in some extent, while there has been some significant problem. But being more clear on the front end helps to alleviate that. I also think that, yes, while some big greens have had issues in the past, I've been on both sides of it, because I've been on the outside looking in, on the community side, and I actually work with Big Green now. And then I was on the regulating side of Big Green, so it's been weird in all these spaces. But one of the things that I think a lot of the Big Green organizations have begun to realize is that there are opportunities to do better in these environmental justice spaces. Yes, we recognize they have not had a good history in environmental spaces. They have had a history of parachuting in and out. But there have been some reports that have come out that have recognized that there are some issues, and they're starting to address them. So the Green 2.0 is a great example. That's a report. You should look at it. It measures the diversity in some of the big green organizations to track how they're doing. Sierra Club is a part of it. The organization that Moms Clean Air Force is a part of, we work with Environmental Defense Fund. There are a number of sort of the big green organizations that are beginning to change. I was excited that within the past, I think 2 weeks or so, a good friend of mine, Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is a stalwart person in the environmental justice space, has become the new, one of the new vice presidents for the National Wildlife Foundation. National Wildlife Foundation has never really done environmental justice work at all, ever, completely away from their space. Now they have a vice president that is doing environmental justice work. We at Moms Clean Air Force, we have incorporated several programs that are looking at how we are working in diverse spaces. We have a program called Eco Madres that is specifically a Latina focus to talk about climate issues with Latina mothers. Community RX, which was rolled out this weekend. They're planting trees in Atlanta right now today. That is primarily focused in the African American faith base, talking to Black church mothers and getting them involved in this conversation. So, I think that while there have been some historic differences, what has been said earlier, though, is very key. You gotta have allies, and there have to be people working with big green organizations, or at least some of us who have said, we're willing to step in and we're willing to help, we're willing to be advocates, but we're also willing to teach, because that's what we do a lot of times as well. Being on the inside is teaching within the organization. This is what it means to be partnered with a community of color, with a vulnerable community, and we're also educating our colleagues as to why it's so important to stay, remain, not parachute and come in and out, but to understand how this impacts the community. I'm really pleased to see that some of these organizations are now taking a harder, longer look and correcting some of their past mishaps.
Well, I know we didn't get quite to the data question, but I want to also respect everyone's time, so maybe we can, if folks want to stay around a little longer, but I also thought that was a wonderfully kind of a great note to end our formal panel on. And so would you guys join me in just thanking our panelists for their time today? And I also participating and being in a small group, which may not have been what you expected at the beginning of the day, and sharing all of your ideas with us.
Great. I just want to thank our panel and our wonderful moderator,